Excellent. All right, let's get started. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, self-advocates of all ages, welcome to the North Carolina Council on Developmental Disabilities Self-Advocate Discussion Series. As always, I am Chris Hendricks, Policy Education Coordinator for the Council. And on behalf of the Council, thank you so much for being here today. This discussion series is a place for North Carolina self-advocates to gather and engage with each other to talk about things that affect our lives as people experiencing life with IDD and other disabilities. We want this time together used to get to know each other and to get to know the council, where I and other individuals with IDD are leaders, colleagues, and we're valued for our input because we are who we are. People with disabilities should always be valued like that, and this discussion series demonstrates why and how. Y'all should be very excited because this month we're talking about the evolution of the ADA, aka the Americans with Disabilities Act. Happy 34th anniversary. We'll be exploring not only the ADA itself, but the events that led up to the signing of the bill in 1990, what's happened since then, and what's happening now. You might know about events like the Capitol Crawl or the signing of the ADA itself. But did you know that the 504 sit-in, do you know about the 504 sit-in that started it all? How about the Free Our People March? Today we'll learn about these events and much more. After a summary of our disability rights revolution evolution, we'll bring it right back to today and the caravan for disability freedom and justice. Our self-advocate guest speaker today is one of my dear friends and colleagues, Philip Woodward. He will offer information about the ADA and the road ahead for disability rights. And last but not least, of course, as always, we want to hear from you, the self-advocates, our audience. We want to know your thoughts on disability rights today. We want to hear your ADA stories, the good, the bad, and everything in between. Now, to begin with, we can't have a guest like my colleague Philip Woodward without starting things off with our classic joke of the day. It's actually been a while since we've done one or two of these, so it just wouldn't be right to have Philip not take us away. So take us away, sir, whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much, Chris. This is Philip Woodward here. So the first joke of the day is, how does the deaf and hard of hearing community like their jokes? Any guesses, anyone? Don't be shy. The answer is signed, sealed, and delivered, of course. Get it? Signed as in sign language? The second joke of the day is, why did the cookie go to the hospital?
I'd say the cookie
Any
broke.
guesses? The answer is because it felt crummy. You know, like cookie crumbs, crummy. Where's all that laughter? Let's hear it. Thank you,
Philip,
Chris, for giving me the honor of doing the joke of the day.
Thank you, Philip. This is Chris. I promise that if you couldn't hear me, at least you could see my chuckles. Well, 34 years ago and only 9 days from now, this very month, the Americans with Disabilities Act was signed into law. And now that we've started our discussion with some humor, we can jump into our civil rights. July 26, 1990 was its official sign date. It's a civil rights law that prevents discrimination based on disability. The protection crosses several areas, including employment, transportation, public accommodations, government programs, and communications. As of the year 2024, protections around communications now include web accessibility and technology adaptation. And we'll get into that a little bit more later. To begin, let's offer a breakdown of the events we hinted at earlier. We'll start with the 504 sit-in and bring it all the way up to today. Next slide, please. By now, we know that the Americans with Disabilities Act is a monumental civil rights law aimed at prohibiting discrimination against individuals with disabilities. However, its evolution involves a series of pivotal events and movements that have significantly shaped disability rights in the United States. And let's begin with the 504 sit-in of 1977. And by the way, this slide can be included in our resources in a follow-up email to everyone who's interested in studying some of these events. The 504 sit-in was a protest led by disability rights activists demanding the implementation of Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which was the first federal civil rights protection for people with disabilities. Activists occupied federal buildings, most notably the San Francisco Federal Building, for 28 days, resulting in the successful signing of the regulations to enforce Section 504 by Joseph Califano, the then Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. Next event, the Gang of 19 in 1978. The Gang of 19 was a group of disability rights advocates in Denver, Colorado, who staged a protest by blocking buses to demand accessible public transportation. Their actions led to the city of Denver making improvements in transit accessibility, setting a precedent for future transportation activism. Next, we have We Will Ride. In 1983, disability rights activists led by the Americans Disabled for Attendant Programs Today, or ADAPT, organized the We Will Ride protests in Washington, D.C. They demanded accessible public transportation, leading to significant changes and increased awareness of the need for transportation services that accommodate people with disabilities. And now on to one you may have all been familiar with, but if not, it's an exciting one. The Capitol Crawl and the ADA signing of 1990. The Capitol Crawl took place on March 12th, 1990, where disability rights activists, including children, crawled up the steps of the U.S. Capitol to demonstrate the barriers faced by people with disabilities. This powerful protest directly influenced the passage of the ADA, which was signed into law by President George H.W. Bush on July 26th, 1990. Next, the Olmstead decision. The Olmstead versus LC decision by the U.S. Supreme Court held that unjustified segregation of people with disabilities is a form of discrimination under the ADA. It mandated that individuals with disabilities have the right to live in the community rather than being institutionalized if they can be accommodated, in a less restrictive setting. Next, the Spirit of the ADA Torch Rally of 2000. Spirit of the ADA Torch Rally was a nationwide event celebrating the 10th anniversary of the ADA. The relay covered thousands of miles and involved thousands of participants promoting the principles of the ADA and raising public awareness about disability rights. The Free Our People March, organized by ADAPT, saw activists march from Philadelphia to Washington, D.C. The march aimed to advocate for the end of institutionalization and the expansion of community-based services and supports for people with disabilities. Next, the Long Road Home campaign was an annual event highlighting the need for community living options for people with disabilities in 2004 and 2005. It commemorated the Olmstead decision and advocated for the closure of institutions and the provision of home and community-based services. The Road to Freedom was in 2006, was a year-long cross-country bus tour led by disability rights advocates to promote the ADA and raise awareness about the ongoing fight for disability rights. The tour included stops in various cities where activists held events and engaged with local communities. In 2015, we had the ADA Legacy Tour as part of the 25th anniversary celebration for the ADA. It involved a tour across the United States with exhibits, events, and educational activities to honor the history of the ADA and promote its continued relevance and importance. And now we're on to the Caravan for Disability, Justice, Freedom, and Justice. The Caravan for Disability Justice and Freedom is the latest movement advocating for comprehensive disability rights and inclusion. It aims to address contemporary issues facing the disability community, including access to healthcare, employment, and education, as well as fighting against ableism and discrimination. The Caravan was in Raleigh, Durham, and Charlotte just 3 weeks ago. These events collectively highlight the relentless effort of disability rights activists and their impact on shaping policies and social attitudes towards people with disabilities. Now let's take a moment to think about these events. What are your thoughts and feelings about the disability rights movement and the ADA in general, now that we have a better understanding of our history? I hope you feel inspired to join the movement yourself, as I certainly am. Before we move on, does anyone have any comments?
Seems like this information is very important. It helps people with disabilities get more information.
Thank you for sharing that. Okay, well, thanks for taking a moment to think about what everything we just shared. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our self-advocate speaker for today, Mr. Philip Woodward. So Mr. Philip Woodward works as a system change manager for the North Carolina Council on Developmental Disabilities. He is the staff liaison to the Community Living Committee and has led several initiatives for the council, including Project Search, Upward to Financial Stability, and the North Carolina ADA Network. Philip joins us today because he's also a certified ADA coordinator. Philip has a strong background in advocating for people with disabilities, having previously worked as an access specialist for the North Carolina Division of Vocational Rehabilitation Services. He is fluent in American Sign Language, which enhances his ability to connect with and support the disability community. Philip holds a bachelor's degree in English and a law degree from the College of William and Mary. His commitment to disability rights is further reflected in his service on the boards of Arts Access and the Raleigh Mayor's Committee for Persons with Disability. Please give a warm self-advocacy welcome to our friend, Mr. Philip Woodward. Philip, take it away, my friend.
Hello, everyone. This is Philip Woodward. Thank you very much, Chris. I am a male individual wearing a purple polo shirt, and I have an ADA 34 logo as my Zoom Gov background. So that's a brief visual introduction of myself. I wanted to add to what Chris said that I am a certified Americans with Disabilities Act coordinator. And that means I cannot give anybody legal advice, but I can answer the ADA questions and help them find the information they need to answer it. So I'm very excited to talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA as its acronym. On July 26th, we will celebrate the 34th anniversary of the signing of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so we have a picture up here on the screen of President George H.W. Bush signing it into law in the Rose Garden of the White House back in 1990. And he is surrounded by 4 people. 3 of the 4 people surrounding him were self-advocates who had a disability themselves. And the 4th was the parent of a person with a disability. So very quickly, on the left standing up is Reverend Harold Wilk. And then under him, or sitting in the wheelchair, is Evan Kemp, the chairman of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And then seated in the wheelchair on the right, wearing the hat, is Justin Dart, who was the chairman of the President's Committee on Employment of People with Disabilities. And standing behind him is a woman named Swift Perino, who was the chairperson of the National Council on Disability. So you will see this picture a lot during ADA celebrations, and I just wanted to make sure you know who those names are and how all of those individuals are either people with disabilities or a family member themselves. So the ADA says, and I quote, "The nation's proper goals regarding individuals with disabilities are to assure equality of opportunity, full participation, independent living, and economic self-sufficiency for such individuals." So basically, to paraphrase that, the ADA's goal is to provide 4 things that everybody wants, regardless of whether or not they have a disability, which is equal opportunities, full participation in society, independent living, and economic self-sufficiency, or the ability to earn money and pay for expenses in life. Now, if we go to the next slide, it will talk about or show you the 5 parts of the ADA. The ADA has 5 sections, and each section is called a title. So I will briefly tell you what each title does. Title 1 deals with employment, and it prohibits disability discrimination in all employment processes. It applies to employers who hire 15 or more people. Title 2 deals with accessibility in public entities, and this is basically state and local government. And it says people with disabilities will have access, physical access, and program access to their state and local government entities, such as the city hall or the rec center in your town. Title 3 deals with accessibility in businesses. Many of these businesses might be privately owned businesses, but they're called public accommodations in the ADA. And the reason why they're called public accommodations is because they're places that are open to the general public, such as restaurants, hotels, stores, and other places of business like movie theaters and sports stadiums. Then Title 4 is the telecommunication part of the ADA that provide telephone and communication systems, and these must be accessible to the public. So if you've ever gotten a relay call from a deaf person, then that's Title 4 of the ADA in action. And then Title 5 is a short section that has some miscellaneous provisions, and those miscellaneous provisions include protection from retaliation. So if you report an ADA violation or concern, you cannot be retaliated against based on whom you might be reporting. And also this slide has a picture of the accessible icon, which one of our council members, Brendan Hildreth, brought to North Carolina and paints in accessible parking spaces all over the state. So I want to let you know that the ADA is often thought of as a gray law. That means that different people will interpret it differently. In other words, if you read the text of the ADA, it might mean one thing to you, and it might mean something slightly different to somebody else. That's why there have been so many court cases involving the ADA. And in fact, Congress had to pass a act called the ADA Amendments Act of 2008. And one of the things that that act does was to clarify some provisions of the ADA and clarify these provisions because members of Congress were concerned about how some of the courts in the United States were interpreting the ADA over the years since its passage in 1990. I want to share, next slide please, that the ADA would not have become a law without people with disabilities demanding equal access to society in America. And therefore, the self-advocate voice was very important. One thing that you heard Chris Hendricks mention earlier that I will mention again is the Capitol crawl that took place on March 13th, 1990. And that is the image that you see on the PowerPoint now. That shows people with a variety of disabilities wearing blue shirts, climbing up the steps of the Capitol, and they have supporters and cameramen all around them. But more than 1,000 people gathered at the Capitol on March 13th, 1990 to demand the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And more than 60 of those people who had mobility disabilities themselves got out of their wheelchairs, got out of their other mobility devices or dropped their crutches and began walking up the 83 steps that lead to the Capitol. And they did that to protest the building's inaccessibility. So imagine living in a country that talks about how everybody has freedom, the freedom to pursue, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but they can't even enter the Capitol, which is one of the main government buildings in Washington, D.C. So if you were a lawmaker back in 1990 and you saw this happening, it could have had a significant impact on you. Seeing how those people with disabilities could not readily and easily enter the building. And that was one great way to make a statement to show how inaccessible a primary government building in our country is. So this is something that had lawmakers really thinking about what they can do to pass a law to make our society more accessible. And I want to close by saying July 26th should be a national holiday. So be sure to celebrate the ADA on July 26th and use the hashtag ADA34 in all of your social media posts. And with that, I will turn it back over to the esteemed Chris Hendricks. Thank you very much.
Chris, please post the question in the chat from Johnny Thomas to Philip.
Oh, Melissa, you took the words right out of my mouth. So, thank you for pointing that out. I was going to say this next section is really dedicated to you all, the self-advocates, and I'm going to go a little off script here and say all of the positive changes that we've seen so far in the community cannot happen, will not happen, and would not have happened without you sharing your thoughts and feelings and stories. So when we as a council have these events, I must just re-emphasize that they are for you, the self-advocates. We want to hear from you. We want to see you. We want to understand how you feel as a community. And that brings us to some of the feedback that you've already shared in the chat. If you have any questions, concerns, or stories, feel free to share them in the chat or unmute and share them live. And I encourage each and every one of you, if you have the courage to do so, if you're off camera, to come on camera so that we can feel more connected to you. There is no obligation for you to do so if you're not comfortable with that, but if you are comfortable at this time, pretty please come on camera, because it makes us feel more connected to this community. And that brings me to Johnny Thomas's comment in the chat. This is directed to Philip. Why is there not a title of the ADA that addresses disability rights in housing and the accessibility ramps, wider doorways, etc.?
Hi, this is Philip Woodward here. I'm actually answering that question in the chat right now. But in passing the ADA and in designing this legislation, Congress decided that the ADA would not apply to private homes or private residences. So in other words, your house that you live in or your apartment that you live in does not have to be accessible to people with disabilities or comply with the ADA. However, I'm going to show this, that if a housing developer and a landlord want to be forward thinking and incorporate principles of universal design into their buildings, then they can make the building more accessible at the outset to everyone who might live there. And they will not be excluding anybody, and they will not have to pay for modifications later, like adding a grab bar to the bathroom wall, or adding a ramp to the entrance of the apartment building, or a ramp to the entrance of the house. So there are things that they can do to make private residences accessible, but Congress was focused on making society and public places and places of employment accessible through the ADA, and they weren't focused on what happens in private residences. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you for that answer, Philip. This is Chris. And thank you to the people that I've seen who are able to pop on camera. We really appreciate you. And we understand you if you can't, but we always appreciate it if you're able. I'd like to draw your attention to the PowerPoint slide. These 4 questions are just prompts to help encourage responses, so you can answer any of these questions that you like, or you can ask any question or share any story that you would like. We're free-flowing. This is a free-flowing discussion. There's a reason why we call it the Self-Advocate Discussion Series, but I'll go over these 4 questions for us right now. And again, you can answer them however you feel most comfortable. Share your stories or answers in the chat, or questions in the chat. Or if you're able, we'd love to hear your voice. Raise your hand physically and unmute if you can, or you can raise your electronic hand using the Zoom icon, and we'll monitor the chat as a staff and call on you as we're able. But here are the questions one by one. Number 1, what does the ADA mean to you? Number 2, share when the ADA has made a positive difference in your life. Number 3, what is something you couldn't do today without the help of the ADA? Number 4, what is an accessibility device we have because of the ADA? So those are the 4 questions. Don't let these 4 questions limit you. Only allow them to guide you. Any stories you want to share about the Americans with Disabilities Act, your own advocacy story, disability rights, anything. Philip just typed it in the chat again. We want to hear from you. Don't be shy. Would anyone like to start us off with their own thoughts on the ADA?
I will.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, whoever.
all I was gonna say is that the ADA has opened my eyes to my own rights. And I appreciate that the things that people before me did so that I can live a normal life.
Thank you for that. We are indeed standing on the shoulders of giants.
Hi, Chris. This is Lila Woodward, Philip's wife, actually. While I don't have a, I guess, traditional disability, I was born with 6 congenital heart defects and I've had a pacemaker since I was a month old. So in some ways it's a health disability. I feel like the ADA has helped me in that people in public places are more aware of the need for accommodations and the fact that people of all ages can have special needs. When I was about 8 years old, before the ADA was passed, I was flying home from camp on my own, and the TSA people tried to physically force me through a metal detector because they didn't believe that I had a pacemaker because I looked too young in their opinion. But now with the ADA, I have no problem requesting different accommodations go around the metal detectors, and at like even at concerts, I will say, you know, I have a pacemaker, and there's often like a DPAC, a specific accessibility entrance where I can go through and not be exposed to the metal detectors and stuff like that. And so it's a lot less stress on my life, and it's very helpful for me. I just feel like generally also I work with children with disabilities, so I've seen a lot through working with their parents, how much the ADA has helped everybody, but just the increased knowledge that there are people of all ages out there with needs that need accommodations. I think that's the biggest thing that the ADA has helped in my life, and obviously my wonderful husband, you know, so.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Lila. That was a wonderful response. And Philip, this is Chris. Would you mind sharing would you mind sharing your answer to Mary's question in the chat, just in case people wanna catch the audio?
This is Philip Woodward here. Mary asked in the chat, what should a worker at disability rights do about their own discrimination there at the job? And I replied in the chat, Mary, a worker at disability rights should request a reasonable accommodation from their supervisor. The hope is that providing the reasonable accommodation will help the employee thrive, which will help disability rights or the business thrive. And I would like to add this, an agency like Disability Rights that is involved in, you know, helping people with disabilities with their legal issues and assessing their civil rights out there in everyday life wants to make sure they're not forgetting about accommodating their employees who have disabilities themselves. And it's possible that as an employer, you think you are accommodating your employee who has a disability, but it is important to have a conversation with the employee to find out everything that that employee needs to be successful at the job. And if they need a reasonable accommodation that is based on their disability, how can you as an employer provide a reasonable accommodation for your employee that will help your employee do the job and that will help your business be successful?
Thank you, Philip. I have talked to a lady, this is Mary, and I have talked to a lady who is currently employed at a disability rights in another state. And she is really having trouble with people fussing at her and demanding that she does things real quick. And because of her brain injury, she needs time to process information. She says they're changing things all the time and that they're really actually fussing at her. So I feel like this is a great time for me to get some information to relate to her. I've already mentioned the ADA and the Rehabilitation Act to her. But I didn't know I was actually gonna get to go one-on-one asking, about this. I wish I had her here. Our disability rights organizations, are they federally funded?
To answer your question, yes, they are federally funded. I'm part of the North Carolina PNA. This is Jonathan Ellis.
Okay. I thought they were, and I told her to fall back on the ADA information. And I'm just really making sure I gave her the right information. Okay.
This
They,
is, go ahead.
I see that, and I'll take it down and mail it to her.
This is Chris. As individuals with disabilities, we should always fall back on the Americans with Disabilities Act. I love that thinking and that thought process. I know we have a couple hands raised. I just want to address number 3. I've been asked to really emphasize it, so let me just reread it for those interested. What's something you couldn't do today without the help of the ADA? Now, I know this is going to be a bit of a cliche example, but I want to talk elevators. Yes, elevators existed before the Americans with Disabilities Act. However, after the Americans with Disabilities Act, if a building had stairs, there needed to be an elevator in it. So I can just tell you, as a boy born with cerebral palsy in 1985, I'm really, really grateful to have been born during the time, and grown up in a time where elevators became the norm in more modern buildings, because I would not be able to, stairs and I do not get along. And so there's lots of things that I would not be able to do without elevators. And I also spent the majority of my life in a wheelchair. So there's a lot of things that I would not be able to do, particularly living in an urban area, without required ramps and curb cuts for individuals with disabilities. So that's just one example, but there's a lot out there. I would love for y'all to share some of your own. Go ahead.
My reason for liking the ADA, this is Jonathan again, is I know we're having employment issues, but we would not even have the ability to be employed without the ADA.
Thank you for that, Jonathan. Philip, you're unmuted. Go ahead.
This is Philip Woodward here. Jonathan, I want to thank you for what you said. When you said we would not have the ability to be employed without the ADA. Well, actually, an employer can hire a person with a disability anytime. And people with disabilities were hired before 1990, but the ADA says that your employer if they have 15 or more employees, has to provide a reasonable accommodation. So the ADA provides a greater chance that you will be successful. And in the employment conversation we were having, I want to share something interesting with you all that I didn't share yet. But the ADA itself does not apply to the federal government. So when you're talking about the ADA, you might think the ADA means federally funded organizations have to accommodate people with disabilities, and the Capitol has to have an elevator or a ramp in Washington, D.C. But actually, other laws, such as the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, apply to the federal government or to programs receiving federal funding. But that's what I've been told, that the ADA doesn't apply to the federal government itself. So I just wanted to make you aware of that. Thank you.
Yeah, this is Chris. I was also just thinking that, again, thanks to the ADA, it's not as though it would have been, I would not have been able to travel without the ADA, but thanks to the ADA, travel has become much easier. And the travel regulations that airlines now need to follow to support persons with disabilities and accommodate things like wheelchairs and early boarding is really, it allows me to travel in the sense that if we didn't have those accommodations and if the ADA didn't require these things, I can't speak for all persons with disabilities, but I think that travel would be such a hassle that I wouldn't want to try. I wouldn't want to bother attempting to do so.
This is Philip here. I see a question that's just appeared in the chat. The question says, just to clarify, can the ADA help the parent with children with disabilities? Example, job accommodations. The ADA can help anybody that has a disability, and that might be helping the family as a whole. So, for example, okay, if we're thinking about employment, if you are working and you have a child with a disability, the ADA does not entitle you to get an accommodation from work that might be getting time off of work to take care of your child with a disability. It's possible there could be some other law, such as the Family Medical Leave Act law, that will give you the time off that you need to take care of a child with a disability. If we're thinking in a different context about ramps, for example, a ramp at an amusement park, not only does that help a parent pushing a child who's using a wheelchair, but that also helps a parent pushing a child who's using a stroller. So that's one way that the ADA can help family members who don't have a disability at all. So it's a way that the ADA helps society in general by providing more easy access to everyone who might be trying to get into a building. Does that make sense? Thank you.
Philip, this is Chris. I don't want to take up too much time. I feel like I've shared too much already, but I also want to point out that my mother, one of her dreams was to take me to Disney World. And she specifically waited until 1992 to take me. One, because she thought I would be old enough to remember the experience, but two, before 1990, there just wasn't Disney didn't have the accommodations for persons with disabilities that they do now. Now, with that said, Disney did accommodate persons with disabilities in different ways before the passage of the ADA. But after the passage of the ADA in 1990, the park became much more accessible for people like me. So that's why my mom waited. Anyone else have an ADA story they want to share? Go ahead.
This is Philip here. Hearing nobody speak immediately, I will respond to the next question in the chat from Johnny Thomas saying, is there a grassroots or established movement to change the Congress initial decision not to include housing in the ADA statutes because of the economic and social changes or challenges causing many individuals and disability to have to be renters of homes or apartments? Johnny, there is a Fair Housing Act that says landlords generally need to provide reasonable accommodations for renters with disabilities. And the Fair Housing Act also applies to things such as having a service animal or an assistance animal in your apartment, where a landlord might have a rule that you cannot have a pets, a no pets policy, but a service animal is not a pet, and so allowing a service animal would be an example of a reasonable accommodation. So I think you're interested in the Fair Housing Act and what the Fair Housing Act is doing to ensure that apartments will be more accessible to people with disabilities. That doesn't mean that the Fair Housing Act is doing everything that it can do right now, but that's an area we want to look at. Thank you.
Thanks, Philip. This is Chris. I just want to read Lila shared an answer to question number 4. She said, for me, the answer to question 4 that comes to mind is visual smoke alarms. As soon as Philip and I got married and moved in together, we bought a visual smoke alarm, which made me feel so much better about Phil being home alone since he cannot hear the fire alarm.
And this is Philip. To follow up on things like visual fire alarms, my thanks to the ADA story is captioning and television. Before 1990, I would enjoy watching TV, but I might laugh when the audience laughed at a sitcom without really knowing what they were laughing at. And then when I got a TV with the closed captioning decoder in 1991, I could understand everything that I'd been missing in the past, and I could get all the punchlines and laugh at the same time the audience is laughing. Thank you.
That's awesome. This is Chris. I just wanted to share that Sierra Jones said, I would love to see more quiet areas for kids that are sensitive to noises or large crowds in doctors' offices and hospitals. That would be very helpful to our growing autism family. You're absolutely right, which brings us to the thought or the reminder that there are visible and invisible disabilities, and both of those deserve reasonable accommodation. Speaking of reasonable accommodation, let me rephrase one of these questions. Can anyone share a reasonable accommodation that they've received, either at work or at home or in any environment, that's made their life easier as a result of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Maybe that would help encourage some sharing, some feedback.
Chris, this is Jonathan again. My apartment had a tub in it, but before I moved in, a shower was put in. A roll-in shower was put in instead.
That's awesome. It's a wonderful accommodation. This is Chris. Grant Pearson shared in the chat, elevators in buildings such as schools, workplaces, and apartment buildings are a very important accessibility device for the disabled to meet their accommodations. Absolutely. Philip, in response to Sierra, says many sports teams are designating quiet areas and sensory-friendly rooms in their stadiums. And Veripi Jones says there is a sensory museum in Greensboro. And Suzanne says the buttons you push to open doors electronically have been very valuable. That's true. I read about that electronic opening doors were partially as a result of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And that's huge. And I actually want to share, I think there are some areas that could use taking away heavy doors and replacing them with lighter doors for persons with disabilities. I don't know about y'all, but heavy doors make my life a lot harder when I'm trying to get places. We've got a little bit more time for some more sharing if anyone would like to jump in. Dan Young, you have your hand up.
Hi, yeah, I have a recent example of like an ADA story. I recently came across the plans for a new park in southern Wake County. It's called Beach Bluff Park. And I was looking at their site plan and it only showed one accessible parking spot in their parking lot. And it also showed a lot of paved walking trails. And so I sent an email to the director of the park and asked them if they were going to include more parking spaces and talked about the different areas of the park where they could use more accessible parking spaces. And not really expecting a response back, but about a day later I got an email from the program director saying that they had all these plans to put in accessible spots and where they were going to put them, and that all of the trails, the paved trails, would be accessible and all that kind of stuff. And I just felt that was like a really encouraging that, even though it didn't show up on the plan, that they definitely had those ideas in place, and that the park will be very accessible and should be a pretty nice place to visit once it's ready to go later this year.
Oh, Dan, that's huge. I'm so glad you got that response. We've got maybe time for one or two more stories or comments. Ciaria Jones, you got your hand up. Would you like to share?
Hi. So one thing I do love now that because we're kind of there at Atrium of Levine's Center a lot. Their elevators actually speak and let you know what floor you're on. So for those that are, unable to see the buttons or what have you, they are like the elevators actually speak the number of floor that you're going to and let you know the destination that you're going to also. And I felt like that was a very good add on to the elevators, and I really wish they would put that on all the elevators at the hospital. Because even on the normal side of the hospital where they keep the regular patients, I feel like that would be very helpful to other folks beyond the children's side. So, but I really did enjoy, like, hey, we're going to the 5th floor, oncology. You know, I felt like that was really good.
That is really cool. I would not, I'm so glad you brought that up. This is Chris. I would not have thought of that. It's a really, really cool chair. Okay, I think we've got time for maybe one more story, comment, question. Any thoughts on the ADA? The good, the bad, the ugly, anything you're interested in. Uh, any last minute shares?
One.
Kevin, you wanted to share?
I'm Kevin Williams from Charlotte. I am old enough to see the difference the ADA has changed people's minds and how commonplace accommodations like Chris said, elevators, curb cuts, and accessible entrances in restaurants. Recently, I traveled to places out of the country, specifically to Rome, Italy. And as Americans know, step entries to restaurants and accommodations for power chairs and anything bigger than a manual wheelchairs is pretty much non-existent as of last year, while I was there visiting to scope out venues for a conference. The staff at some place
Kevin, this is Chris.
Kevin, this is Philip Woodward here. Thank you for telling us about traveling to places like Rome, Italy. And I'm going to point out that the Americans with Disabilities Act does not apply to other countries, but other countries may have their own disability laws. And you want to look into that before you travel to another country to make sure you will be able to get around and access wherever you need to go there. And I do know a international traveler with a disability who's been to all 7 continents, so it is possible. Thank you.
Philip, I don't know who that is, but I'm gonna look him up and figure out how to do that. This is, ladies and gentlemen, we're at the 2-minute mark.
It's Chris, it's Corey Lee.
Oh,
Curb free with Corey Lee.
Herb Free with Corey Lee. I'll check
Yes.
that out. Happy birthday. Let's everyone say a quick happy birthday, because tomorrow is Philip Woodward's birthday. So happy birthday to Philip. And while you're all saying happy birthday to Philip, I'll go over these resources really quick. Check out the information on the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Caravan for Disability Freedom and Justice, the Rally for Disability Justice, and of course, Crip Camp. If y'all haven't seen that documentary, it's amazing. I'll send all of these resources out in a follow-up resources email. Once again, here are your voting resources. Y'all, voting is important. It is the most powerful way we can be seen and heard, and we use more accommodations than any group. So let's utilize that power. Upcoming events and opportunities. Speaking of voting, September 9th through the 13th is Disability Voting Rights Week. We'll talk more about that next month. And speaking of next month, August 21st is our next self-advocate discussion series session. So be sure to sign up and join us for that. Ladies and gentlemen, it truly has been a pleasure. I want to take a moment to thank our ASL interpreters and our Spanish interpreters, our captioner, all the behind the scenes staff that make this magic work so well. Y'all don't even understand, man. On the top, it looks like us ducks are calm, but our feet are moving at 1,000,000 miles an hour underneath. And of course, I want to take the moment to thank all of you, our self-advocates, for your stories, your feedback today. Happy almost 34th anniversary in 9 days of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And we will see you next month and hopefully see you next year for Big 35. We appreciate everything that you've shared and said today. Thank you all. Sign up for next month and we'll talk to you soon.
Okay, have a nice day.
Everyone, this is Philip Woodward. Great to see you all today. And it's great to hear your questions and stories. Celebrating 9 days. And thanks for the birthday wishes in the chat for my birthday tomorrow. July is the best month. But it's because of the ADA, not because of me.
All right, this is just staff and presenters, and including interpreters.
Looks like it is
Excellent.
now.
Well, congratulations, team. Another very well done event. I feel like we're missing somebody. So does anybody want to throw out a quick comment about how they thought the session went?
This is Chris. I'll just quickly share. I'm so glad we got some momentum on the questions and the ADA stories. I was a little bit worried at first, but then once we got some momentum and people started sharing, more people started sharing, and we were able to fill up that time. So super grateful for that.
Yeah, Philip, this is Melissa. Well done, Philip, and thank you for inviting and making sure that your wife came to this session. That was a really wonderful surprise. I see Irlanda's hand is up. Go ahead.
Before you continue, you're still recording. I stopped my recording, but so somebody's still recording this. So if you are going to show it later,